Welcome. All right, let's get us started right on time here. So with us today, we have Dr. Jay Greene. He is a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation for the Center of Educational Policy. His focus of current research are the effects of education on charter formation and civic values.
Character.
Oh, character.
Yeah.
Yes, character.
Yeah.
Makes a difference.
Charters too.
Charters too.
Yeah.
Previous topics of research have ranged from, school choice and the effects of field trips all the way to museums and theaters. So with that, we'll pass it off to Dr. Greene.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here. This is a great gathering. Excited to be included in this. So I'm here to tell you the right and wrong ways. And whenever, you have the charge of saying what the right and wrong way are, you've put yourself on shaky turf already. So I'll try to make it lighthearted by asking those of you who are old enough to remember, how do I get it? Escape? There we go. And then, okay. Asking those of you who are old enough to remember the Goofus and Gallant comic from Highlight magazine in the doctor's waiting room. When you were a kid and you were waiting, there was the search and find the images. There was that, which I really did enjoy. But there was also Goofus and Gallant. And Goofus and Gallant basically explained to you the right and wrong way to do things. And they helpfully explain it with their names. Goofus is the one who does it wrong, and Gallant is the one who does it correctly. So here, for example, Goofus leaves the door open, Gallant closes the door. I'm so glad that we had Goofus and Gallant to explain these things to us. So I feel like I'm the Goofus and Gallant comic, potentially being unhelpful and unfunny. But maybe it'll be provocative and we can have an interesting conversation about it. So let's take what schools might do to try to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion and put it in kind of a Goofus and Gallant framework. And it might look something like this. Pardon the unequal font. Apparently Gallant is much bigger than Goofus. So these are very crude dichotomies. Although the joke is that there are two kinds of people: the people who put people in two kinds and the people who don't. So I'm the kind that puts people in two kinds. So the Goofus way to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion is to divide people into oppressors and oppressed. That is to think that there are two categories of people in the world, other than Goofuses and Gallants, that there are oppressors and oppressed. And the reason why it's pernicious to divide the world into oppressors and oppressed is that it justifies unequal treatment under the law. That is, oppressors are thought to deserve harsh treatment because they have behaved wrongly, and the oppressed are deserving of remediation, compensation for having been wronged. And therefore, it justifies unequal treatment under the law. I think a Gallant would promote diversity, equity, and inclusion by emphasizing that all people are equal and should be thought of as equal in the eyes of God and in their treatment under the law. A Goofus way to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion is also to create bureaucracies that articulate and enforce the orthodoxy that there are two categories of people, oppressors and oppressed. These bureaucracies, which are the diversity, equity, and inclusion staff in many organizations, they're there to articulate and enforce this orthodoxy of two classes of people. But in doing so, what they do is they stifle an open intellectual exchange, and they, by enforcing an orthodoxy, they prohibit critical examination of that orthodoxy, which can be unhealthy and lead to abuse. a better approach that Gallant would pursue is to allow critical examination and discussion of foundational principles. And Goofus would then allow that bureaucracy, the DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion bureaucracy, to engage in extortion to promote personal interest and agendas. That is, that once they have this perch of authority to articulate and enforce an orthodoxy, they can also use that position of power to extract other benefits. And one of the main things that they tend to pursue is the expansion of themselves. That is, more for themselves. More positions in their unit. That possibility of patronage then also gives them power. That is, they have the ability to offer jobs to people, which is helpful for them. But it allows them to pursue the interests of power and expanding that base of power, and also to use that base of power to promote other agendas that are not actually related to diversity, equity, inclusion, but may be preferred by themselves anyway. A better way, the Gallant way to promote diversity, equity, inclusion is to keep bureaucracy constrained and focused on common mission. Now, this is all obviously a very simplistic and crude way to think about this issue, but I put it forward just because I want you to think critically about the idea of how we pursue diversity, equity, inclusion. Those all sound like good words, and they are mostly good words. Diversity is a legitimate good goal for organizations. We do want to promote diversity on multiple dimensions, and inclusion is clearly a good word. We do want to be welcoming of people from different backgrounds, with different experiences, with different ideas, and so being welcoming, to be inclusive, is a good thing. Equity sounds like a good word. It's adjacent to the word equality, which is a good thing, but equity has more to do with the same result, which is less good and potentially bad, while equality is, I think something that we might prefer anyway. But the idea of diversity, equality, inclusion are legitimately good things, but as you might imagine, there are better ways of pursuing those good things, and there are bad ways of pursuing those things that might actually undermine those legitimately good goals and produce the opposite of what is intended. That is, you might actually end up with strategies for promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion that reduce diversity, that undermine equality, and that actually are unwelcoming or against inclusion. And so at the Heritage Foundation, I've done a series of studies where we've actually empirically looked at diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, particularly in higher education, but also in the K-12 space. And actually, we did it in a series of 3 studies: diversity university, equity elementary, and inclusion delusion. It was DEI in order. It was a thing of beauty. And so let me show you some of those empirical results, because mostly I'm an empirical researcher. That is, I just like to count things. So what they mean, we can have a good conversation about, but at least I've counted some things. So let's look at what I've counted. So first, we've looked at the extent to which a certain worldview has become predominant within the charter school space and factors that are related to that. So what we're loosely calling here as wokeness, which is an ill-defined term which we might understand to represent the worldview of the Goofus approach to DEI. And we might, the way we measured the extent of wokeness in charter schools is we looked for certain key words in their student handbooks. We simply searched for the extent to which those keywords were common. Not because those keywords are bad words, but because they're understood to be a proxy for this particular worldview. And the student handbook is a form of communication from the school to current and prospective families about what it is that their school is doing. And it's also communication to authorizers about what that school is doing. And to the extent that the authorizers are more powerful than the parents, the authorizers' preferences will be given privilege. And to the extent that the authorizers are less powerful and parents are more powerful in shaping the future of that school, then the authorizers' preferences will be subordinate to the preferences of parents. And what we find is that the more that you have strong authorizers in a state, that is, the more that the authorizers determine what happens in schools more than parents do, the more woke those student handbooks are. The more woke key terms you can find in those handbooks. So what that reveals is that the average family does have a taste for wokeness, but their taste on average is much less than the average taste of authorizers or regulators. So that is, people who are making decisions for their own children want less of this than people who are making decisions for other people's children. Right? And that's important to keep in mind. It also tells us that it varies across states, and that charter schools in some states are more woke because of the authorizer environment than in other states. And that if we want to empower parents more, we would actually, on average, dramatically reduce the average wokeness in charter schools. And this is true, by the way, independent of the political ideology of the state. So, for example, you could see that Alabama, there kind of in the middle, is kind of relatively high on the wokeness measure, even though it's actually not a particularly weak authorizer state. It's a fairly strong authorizer state. So it's not merely political ideology that's driving it. Similarly, you could see down there at the bottom right corner, Minnesota is a very liberal state, yet because it has a lot of parental empowerment in its charter system, the average wokeness in Minnesota schools is much lower. Right? So this is not merely a reflection of the political preferences of people in the state, but it has to do with the political system of authorizing charter schools. So that was one study we did, was the relationship between the strength of authorizers versus parents and the average wokeness of charter schools. So we also have looked at the extent to which public school districts in the United States have what's called a chief diversity officer. So a chief diversity officer would be a sign that a school is building out a DEI bureaucracy with the purpose of articulating and enforcing that political orthodoxy. And what we looked at, every school district in the United States with at least 15,000 students, there are 500 and some of them. And what we found is that overall, 30-some% of all school districts in the United States with at least 15,000 students have a chief diversity officer or something with an equivalent title to chief diversity officer. But this is much more common in bigger school districts, but it actually flattens out so that it's still fairly common even in the small districts. It's not linear. It slopes up with the really big districts, but then it flattens out as you get into the smaller districts, so that even the districts with 50,000 students have about as many chief diversity officers, or are as likely to have chief diversity officers as those with 15,000 students. So it flattens out. So you have a lot of chief diversity officers beginning to be created in public school districts. It's started out at the university level, it's making its way down into K-12, and it's starting with bigger districts, but it's making its way out into the small districts too. We also looked at the relationship between whether school districts had a chief diversity officer and test score gaps, achievement gaps. So ostensibly, the purpose of these chief diversity officers educationally in K-12 districts is to address achievement gaps. And So when we look at it, what we find actually is that achievement gaps are larger on average in districts with chief diversity officers than they are in districts without. Now, it might be that the causation goes in the opposite direction, right? It might be that places with large achievement gaps recognize they have a problem, they think they need to do something about this problem, so they adopt chief diversity officers. Well, we also looked at change in achievement gaps over time. And what we found is that the districts with a chief diversity officer, not only did they have larger achievement gaps, but they had more rapidly growing achievement gaps than districts without chief diversity officers. Now, that's not a rigorous causal research design. It doesn't prove that the chief diversity officers cause achievement gaps, but it does suggest that they appear not to be productive at addressing this problem, which is ostensibly their main purpose. And it reinforces our theory that actually they have different purposes. Their purposes, again, are political more than they are educational. That is, they're articulating and enforcing an ideological orthodoxy on a set of divisive issues within their school districts. And by doing so, they are strengthening and mobilizing what are actually the preferences of a minority of constituents within those districts. So a lot of stuff that's happening in schools is not being driven by broad popular demand. A lot of stuff that's happening is being driven by well-organized, smaller groups, but they're vocal, they're well-organized, and they have institutional advantages that help them be more effective in achieving their goals, right? So it's not as if everyone wants this, and as we've seen, the average parent actually wants this kind of stuff less than the average authorizer, and so similarly, the average teacher, the average family within public school districts tends not to want this stuff as much as what they're getting, but they're getting it anyway because there's an institutional advantage that the other side has with respect, by virtue of having chief diversity officers. So we also created an interactive website so you can look up each of these 500 and some school districts. So if you're in a school district with at least 15,000 students, or curious about a district with at least 15,000 students, you can look that district up and you can see the title of the chief diversity officer, information about the enrollment, and then information about achievement gaps in that district. So we also, as I mentioned, have looked at this issue in the higher education space. It's more commonly thought of as a higher education issue to have DEI than in K-12. It started there first and has expanded there more rapidly. We wanted to get a sense of how much it has expanded, how big it is. So we do the thing that I like doing, which is we counted. We just counted things, and we counted how many diversity, equity, inclusion personnel are there at school. So we looked at the 65 universities in the Power 5 athletic conferences, and we picked athletic conferences because that's the most important thing about higher education. No, actually we picked, truthfully, I was being goofus there, to be gallant. We picked these universities because these are large state flagship universities that are respected public institutions for the most part. But it also includes some high-profile private institutions. Duke and Northwestern are also included in the Power 5 athletic conferences. So it gives you a good slice of American higher education where many, many people go for their education. And what we found is that the average school had more than 45 people working in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, it's important to keep in mind what's not included in this. We are not counting anyone who works in legal compliance. So there are units within universities that are there for Title IX compliance, for example, which is to ensure that the university complies with federal anti-discrimination laws and make sure that the university doesn't get sued for violating those laws. We don't count any of those people. We're not counting people who are there to help make sure that the university complies with the law and is not sued for discriminating. Okay, we don't count those people. And we're not counting any faculty, professors, who are engaged in academic departments who teach and do research that may be related to the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're not counting those. We're not counting faculty, and we're not counting legal compliance. So who are these people? They're staff. And they're staff who are there ostensibly to help promote diversity, welcome people from diverse backgrounds, make them feel included. They're ostensibly to do that, okay? So how big is this effort? 45 of those people on average at a university. Now, how big is 45? So to put that in perspective, we measured how big it is relative to how many people universities have to ensure legal compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. How many people do they have in the want to, but not must to, of DEI versus the must to of ADA compliance? Well, it's more than 4 times as many DEI staff as ADA compliance staff. That's how big the effort is. Another way to put it in perspective is how many DEI staff are there relative to faculty? On average, you have 3.4 DEI staff for every 100 faculty, or essentially 1 DEI staff person for every 33 professors on campus. Okay? Another way to put it in perspective is how big is the DEI staff relative to the history faculty? So, and what you can see is that on average, you actually have 40% more people working as DEI staff at universities than you have tenured or tenure track history faculty. So that's how big the effort is. We similarly have an interactive website where you can look up each of the 65 universities and see how big they are. The University of Michigan has the biggest. It had 163 DEI personnel when we looked at this. That's almost 15 times as many as they have ADA compliance people. It's 5.8 DEI staff for every 100 faculty, or more than 1 for every 20 professor. And it's more than twice as large as their tenured or tenure track history faculty. Okay, so it's a very, very large thing at the University of Michigan. Interestingly, we also looked at what are called campus climate surveys. Now, campus climate surveys are things that institutional research gives to students at universities to kind of track how things are going, how do people feel about the university. Not every university does it. Not every university does it every year. Not every university makes the information publicly available. Not every university asks the questions in the same ways. And so we weren't able to do a systematic comparison, but we could do a selective comparison with what was available. And what we found is that student reports of campus climate, even with respect to diversity issues, were no better and were often worse at places with larger DEI faculty than at places, DEI staff, than places with smaller DEI staff. So for example, Mississippi State has a very small DEI staff, but students reported a more positive campus climate with respect to diversity than they did at the University of Michigan. Okay? Now this doesn't prove that the DEI staff caused students to be unhappier at Michigan than at Mississippi State. But again, this is suggestive that these staff are perhaps not helpful on their ostensible purpose and may in fact be counterproductive because they may in fact be more focused, as we suspect, on political activity than they are on actually making people feel more welcome and bringing people in from many different kinds of backgrounds. One other indication of how DEI staff may be counterproductive in achieving the goals of being inclusive is we were interested in how DEI staff behaved with respect to anti-Semitism. And so what we did is we took the DEI staff lists that we had compiled for our study where we looked at the 65 universities. We had the names and titles of everyone who was DEI staff. And then we searched for their Twitter accounts. And mind you, we weren't able to find everyone's Twitter account. Not everyone has a Twitter account. Some people have Twitter accounts, but they're not public accounts. So this is not a representation of all DEI staff necessarily, but it is a representation of those for whom the information is available. And then what we did is we searched their Twitter feeds for every time they mentioned Israel and every time they mentioned China. Okay. We had a suspicion that they had an intense hostility to Israel, and that this hostility may not be motivated particularly by human rights concern, because we suspected they might not be as critical of China, which is not famous for its fantastic human rights record. So what we found actually is, first, DEI staff tweet a lot more about Israel than they do about China, even though Israel's a very small country, China's a very big country. This was during the pandemic when people might have a lot of reason to talk about China. What we found is that they talked about Israel more than 3 times as much as they talked about China on Twitter. Okay, so they were relatively obsessed with Israel compared to China. And they were almost uniformly critical of Israel when they talked about Israel. Okay. But with respect to China, the majority of their comments were positive. They had nice things to say about China, and very harsh things to say about Israel. Now, this lends credence to the idea that DEI staff are not particularly focused as professionals in welcoming diverse groups and making them feel included, right? But instead, it gives the suggestion that they have a particular kind of ideological worldview, and that ideological worldview is hostile towards Israel for a variety of reasons. Those reasons don't include concerns about human rights, since they're selectively critical of human rights abusers, potentially. And so this would be a little bit like if we kind of went around looking for in parking lots to see outside of doctors' offices if doctors were standing outside smoking cigarettes, right? You know, they're free to smoke cigarettes. It's not against the law, but we would think that it would be contrary to the ostensible professional obligation of a doctor if we went around to parking lots and we saw them outside smoking a lot. Outside of their offices, we think, well, maybe they weren't really as focused on promoting health as we thought they were, since they don't seem to be doing that when we catch them unaware. Similarly here, when we catch DEI staff unaware, they don't seem to be behaving in a particularly welcoming and inclusive way, which again suggests that that is not really what they're about, that they may be working against those purposes.